loader was already moving when Rowan Merritt pulled into the back lot of Route 12 Farm Market on the second Tuesday of April. She could see it from the road. The yellow arm lifting the bucket full of burlap sacks, potatoes spilling out the torn edges as the machine rolled slow toward the dumpster. Some of the sacks had gone
This isn't
dark at the
working out
bottom.
anymore.
A few had split open entirely.
I'm
The
leaving.
smell reached the road before the sight did, that specific sweet rot of a vegetable breaking down after too long in a storage room that got a degree too warm and stayed that way. She parked, she got out. She walked straight up to the man running the loader, a young hand named Dane Pruitt, and she said, "Stop.
Yeah, I hope she
I'll
doesn't
take
break
all
a
of them."
nail.
Dane actually laughed before he caught himself.
you're
All of
almost
them?
done over there.
All of them. Curtis Holloway, the market manager, came out of the loading bay wiping his hands on the front of his apron. 55 years old and built like a man who had spent 30 of those years lifting produce crates. He looked at Rowan. He looked at the 400 sacks staged behind the building. He said, "Rowan, there's 400 back here. They're done. Sprouted. Soft. Some of them are liquid at this point. I know what they are. You want 400 sacks of rotten potatoes. I want 400 sacks of potatoes. What they are is my business once they're on my truck." A couple of the dock hands wandered over the way men do when something unusual starts happening, and the work can wait 5 minutes to watch it. One of them, older, with a Marion County feed cap pushed back on his head, looked at the sacks and then at Rowan and said, not unkindly but not kindly either, "Rowan, those potatoes are already trying to leave the bag." A couple of the others laughed. Then Wade Coulter's voice came from the far end of the dock. He had pulled up in his black F-250 to grab feed and had walked over the way men do when they hear a gathering. Wade was 48 years old. He owned 160 acres 2 roads north of the Merritt place. He had never once looked at Rowan without a small, mean smile hiding somewhere at the edge of his mouth. "That field of yours can't grow weeds, Rowan. Now you're feeding it trash." The laughing got a little louder. Wade wasn't finished. "Your daddy had 20 good years and real seed money behind him, and that field beat him every season he tried it. You've got dumpster potatoes in a field that already whipped a better farmer than you. What exactly do you think changes?" That one landed harder than the rest, and Wade knew it. He said it, with the small, satisfied smile of a man who has found the soft place, and pressed on it without quite admitting to himself that is what he is doing. Rowan didn't answer. She had learned a long time ago. Her father had taught her this without ever teaching it directly, just by living it, that answering men like this in a moment like this only fed the moment. She walked to her truck. She backed it to the loading dock. She started loading sacks. By sundown, every man in Marion County knew Rowan Merritt had bought 400 sacks of potatoes nobody would feed to a hog. By the next October, half of them would be eating from the field those potatoes woke up. This is the story of what happened between 6 hours earlier, before the drive to Route 12, before the loader, before Wade Coulter's voice. The morning had started the way every morning at Merritt Farm had started for 3 years running. In the dark, in the cold, alone. Rowan came down the back stairs at 4:30. The kitchen still smelled faintly of last night's coffee and the wood stove burning down to embers. She pulled on the same brown Carhartt jacket she had been wearing since her father died. She stepped into the boots by the back door, her boots, but broken in the way boots get broken in when they have been worn every single day for 1,000 days without exception. The barn thermometer read 38 degrees when she flipped on the light. Her breath went white in the yellow bulb glow. 41 laying hens stirred and made the small sleepy sounds chickens make before dawn. 6 pigs in the pen behind the barn shifted their weight against the boards, waiting. She fed the hens. She topped the water. She scooped grain into the hog trough and watched the pigs come to it in the practical, unhurried way of animals that have never had to worry about where the next meal was coming from, because Rowan Merritt had never once let them worry. Then she stood in the barn doorway with the first pale gray of morning coming up over the fence line, and she pulled the small spiral notebook out of her jacket pocket. She had started keeping it the winter after her father died, partly useful, partly a way of staying connected to how he had thought. She wrote 2 lines. Grain up again. 3rd increase this month. Something has to give somewhere. She closed the notebook. She looked out past the barn toward the north side of the property, where 40 acres of clay sat under the same gray light. Rowan Merritt had been running the Merritt place alone for 3 years, and there was a specific quiet way she looked that field, now that nobody else would have recognized. It was the look of a person who had inherited a problem her father had spent 20 years trying to solve and had failed to solve, and who understood, in the practical way she understood most things, that solving it was going to fall to her whether she was ready or not. She was 34 years old. She had never married. She had come close once in her 20s before deciding that the life she wanted didn't fit easily around a man who wanted something different than farming. And she had made her peace with that in the practical way she made her peace with most things, by not dwelling on it. By working. The farm was solvent, but barely. Egg sales, some hay, the hogs. A small vegetable operation that supplied a farm stand at the end of the drive and two regular restaurants in town. It was enough to keep the lights on and the feed bills paid most months. It was not enough to fix the North 40. It was not enough to hire help. It was not enough to do much beyond keep going. The kitchen table had a stack of paper on it that morning. Feed invoice for April. Property tax reminder from the county. A cover crop seed catalog she had been ignoring for a week because she couldn't afford anything in it. She sat down and drank her coffee and read the feed invoice again. The number at the bottom had climbed by 9% since January. Corn was up, wheat was up. Even the basic layer mash she bought for the hens was up. She thought about the North 40 the way she thought about it every morning, the way you think about a room in the house where a person you love died. Not something you can walk away from. Not something you can quite walk into either. She finished her coffee. She washed the cup. She wrote on the shopping list stuck to the refrigerator. Feed store, layer, hog supplement. She got in the truck. It was her father's truck. A 2004 Ford F-150 with 230,000 miles on the odometer and the same slight pull to the right the alignment had developed a decade ago and that Elias Merritt had never bothered to fix because he knew how to correct for it with his hands. Rowan had learned to correct for it with her hands too, the way you learn a person's walk by, walking beside them for enough years. She drove into town. Route 12 ran east from the farm through 8 miles of flat Ohio farmland and into the little cluster of buildings that called itself the town of Beecher Hollow. Feed store on the left, post office. The diner on Main Street where the fluorescent lights had been on since 5. The elementary school, the Farmers Trust Bank. And at the far end of the strip, the Route 12 farm market, a long, low warehouse building set behind a gravel lot, where produce came in from the county's growers and went out again to the region's grocery chains and school kitchens and small restaurants. Rowan needed feed. She was not planning to go to the market. She was planning to go to the feed store on the other side of town, load her supplement, and drive home. She saw the loader from the road. She was doing 45 past the market driveway when she caught the yellow arm out of the corner of her eye, a bobcat with a wide bucket, lifting a stack of burlap sacks and rolling toward the far corner of the lot where the dumpsters sat. Something about the way the sacks were riding in the bucket made her slow down. She could see the specific slump of them. The way full sacks of good product don't slump. The way sacks slump when what is inside them has started to change. She didn't decide exactly to turn in. Her hands turned in. She rolled slow down the driveway and past the front of the warehouse. She followed the gravel around the side to the back lot where the loading dock ran the length of the building, and she came around the corner and saw all of it. 400 sacks staged behind the building in 3 long rows, some standing upright, some slumped against each other. A few at the bottom of the stacks that had gone dark and were leaking a thin brown liquid onto the gravel. The smell hit her through the open window before she came to a stop. She parked. She got out. She stood for a long moment looking at the 400 sacks. She was doing the math in her head before she was fully aware she was doing it. Grain prices had climbed 9% since January. 400 sacks, some of them still viable as seeds, some of them cooked down could go into the hog ration. Some of them, the truly gone ones, were still organic matter, still carbon, still the raw ingredient of finished compost. And compost was the one thing her father had written about, over and over, across 20 years of trying to fix that field, that he had never been able to afford in the quantities the field actually needed. She stood in the gravel and she watched Dane Pruitt in the bobcat start his slow roll toward the dumpster with the first bucket load of the day. And an idea assembled itself in her chest faster than she could examine it critically. By the time she had walked halfway across the lot, the idea had taken the shape it needed to take. She said it out loud before she had finished deciding it. Stop. I'll take all of them. The sacks were heavy in a way healthy potatoes are not heavy. Wet heavy. The bottoms of some of them had gone soft and the burlap was cold and wet against her arms as she lifted them. Dark stains bled through onto her jacket. The smell was not overwhelming out in the open air, but it was there and it clung. Curtis Halloway helped her load, mostly out of habit. He was a working man, and watching someone else load alone while he stood there empty-handed went against something in him. And as they worked, he said quieter now, just to her. "You sure about this?" "No," Rowan said, "but I'm doing it anyway." He almost smiled at that. He didn't laugh. And before she pulled the tailgate up, he added lower, like it wasn't meant for the crowd behind him. "Every grower on Sutter Creek is short this year. Bottom land got soaked clean through in March. Prices are climbing already. Whatever you're planning, county could use it working out." Rowan filed that away without answering. She caught the last of the joke through her open window as she pulled out. One of the dock hands calling to another, loud enough to carry. "She's going to need more trucks than that when the smell hits." Rowan didn't look back. She drove home the long way, not the fast way through town, past the diner and the feed store and the men who would already be talking about her by lunchtime. She took the county road that ran north past the empty pasture the Corley family had let go to brush. Past the pond where her father had taught her to fish when she was 7. Past the old two-story farmhouse where Alden Whittle still lived alone, at 72 in the house his grandfather had built. The road was empty. The truck bed was full. She could smell the sacks through the back window, and she could feel Wade Coulter's voice sitting in her chest the way a swallowed stone sits in your chest, heavy and specific and not going anywhere on its own. Your daddy had 20 good years and real seed money behind him. She kept her hands on the wheel. That field beat him every season he tried it. She kept her eyes on the road. You've got dumpster potatoes and a field that already whipped a better farmer than you. She pulled into the drive of the Merritt place at 10:40 in the morning with 400 sacks of rotting produce in the bed of her father's truck and Wade Coulter's voice still not letting go. She unloaded alone. It took her most of the afternoon. Merritt Farm sat 2 miles off Route 12 down a gravel driveway, lined with fence posts that leaned at the particular angle of wood that had been standing since before Rowan was born. The farmhouse was white, or had been white once, the way old paint stays mostly the color it started even after decades of Ohio weather. Chalky, faded, peeling at the corners where the sun hit hardest. The barn was red, or had been, and was now the deep brick brown of red paint gone dark with age. Wire fences ran the perimeter of the near pastures, patched in places with newer wire that didn't quite match the old. The visible history of a farm maintained by someone doing the best she could with limited money and limited time. There was the chicken coop near the garden. There was the hog pen behind the barn. There were 3 compost bays built out of old pallets in various stages of breakdown. There was the vegetable plot that supplied the farm stand at the end of the drive, and there was Hollow Ridge Field, 40 acres on the north side of the property, and for as long as anyone in Marion County could remember, 40 acres of nothing but disappointment. The soil there was heavy clay, the kind laid down by an ancient lake bed, dense and mineral-rich in theory, but practically hostile to anything that needed to breathe through its roots. In spring, the field held water like a bowl, standing puddles that took weeks to drain, drowning out anything planted too early. By July, the same field baked into something close to brick, cracked, hard-packed, resistant to a shovel, let alone a root system trying to expand through it. The neighbors called it the brick field. Rowan's father, Elias Merritt, had spent the better part of 2 decades trying to fix it. He had tried different rotations, cover crops, a drainage system that had helped some but not enough, not with the money he'd had to spend on it. He had never given up on the field exactly, but he had never solved it either. And when he died 3 winters ago, a heart that gave out in the barn on a January morning, found by Rowan when she came out for evening chores, Hollow Ridge Field was still 40 acres of expensive disappointment sitting unused at the north edge of the property. She had thought about selling it more than once. A neighbor had asked about it the year before, casual, over the fence. The kind of question that is really an offer dressed up as curiosity. She hadn't sold it. She hadn't been able to give a clear reason why, even to herself, beyond the fact that her father had spent 20 years of his life trying to make that ground work, and something in her wasn't ready to be the one who gave up on it. By late afternoon, the 400 sacks were unloaded and stacked along the center aisle of the barn. Rowan stood in the doorway with the last of the day's light coming through the west window in long, yellow slats, and she looked at what she had bought. The smell was thicker in here now. The concrete floor already had a thin brown stain running out from under the closest sacks. Her hands were cold. Her back was tight. Her jacket was ruined for chores tomorrow. She said nothing out loud. She turned on the barn lights. She went to work. The system was in her head before she started. She hadn't bought the potatoes on impulse, or not entirely on impulse. She had bought them because somewhere in the back of her mind, watching the loader push perfectly usable organic matter toward a dumpster, an idea had assembled itself. And by the time she had walked over and said, "I'll take all of them," the idea had already taken the shape it needed to take. 3 categories. The first, potatoes with strong, healthy sprouts. Firm flesh beneath the sprouting, no significant soft spots. Eyes that looked vigorous rather than desperate. These were seed potatoes. These were the future of Hollow Ridge Field, if the field had a future. The second, potatoes that had gone soft but hadn't crossed into active rot. Mushy in places but not liquid. Still structurally a potato, even if not one anyone would want to eat. These were feed grade. For the hogs. For the chickens. At a fraction of the cost of the grain that was climbing 9% every quarter. The third, the ones that were gone, actively rotting, leaking, beyond feed, beyond seed, but not beyond use because organic matter of any kind, broken down properly in a compost pile with straw and manure and time, became the one thing her father had never been able to afford in the quantities the field actually needed. She worked through the sacks one at a time. She opened each one on the concrete floor under the bare rafter bulbs. She sorted by hand, by feel, by smell. She wrote as she went in the small spiral notebook she kept in her jacket pocket. The barn was cold in a way that seeped up through the concrete into her knees and hands. The bulbs threw hard yellow light down onto the sacks and the long moving shadow of her own body as she bent and lifted and sorted. Potato juice ran out onto the floor in dark rivulets from the worst sacks. Her fingers went numb around the 90th sack and stayed numb for the rest of the night. Her jacket sleeves were stained to the elbows. She thought about her father while she worked, not in any particular sentimental way. Just in the way a person thinks about someone she has done work alongside for 28 years and now does not do work alongside anymore. She thought about how he would have moved through this same task, the specific way he would have handled the sacks, the set of his shoulders when he was working through something he wasn't sure about, the small grunt he made when he lifted something heavy, a sound she had not been aware she was cataloging in her memory until 3 winters after his death, when she caught herself making the same sound and it stopped her cold. By 11, she had done half the sacks. By midnight, she had done 280. By 12:40 in the morning, she was on the last of them. The final count came out at 286 sacks seed grade, 71 sacks feed grade, 43 sacks compost only. She sat down on an overturned crate in the middle of the barn and she looked at the 3 piles. The smell was thick in the enclosed space. Potato juice had pooled in the low spots of the concrete. Her hands were stained the specific brown of iodine and cracked at the knuckles from the wet burlap. Her fingers had gone slightly numb again. She could feel the whole day pressing down against her shoulders. Wade Coulter's voice, the laughing on the dock, the drive home, the unloading, the 4 hours of sorting. She opened one more sack from the compost pile, mechanically, not checking anymore really, just finishing the count. What was inside was completely liquefied. Not a potato anymore, not in any recognizable sense, just gray-brown slime with the ghost of a shape. She sat with the sack open in her lap for a long moment. She thought about the men on the dock laughing. She thought about Wade Coulter's voice. Your daddy had 20 good years and real seed money, and that field beat him. She did not sleep well, and in the morning she got up and she went back out to the barn. And she kept working, because that was the only response she had ever really trusted. 3 days after the sorting, on an evening when the wind rattled the loose kitchen window, the way it always did in early spring, Rowan pulled her father's farm journals down from the shelf in the front room. There were 9 of them, spanning back almost 30 years. The oldest was a black composition book with a broken spine and Elias's handwriting on the inside cover in the cramped, angular hand of a man who did not enjoy writing, but did it anyway because he had learned somewhere along the way that a farm not written down was a farm you would eventually forget the truth of. Elias Merritt had not been a poetic man in his writing. His entries were mostly practical. Weather, planting dates, yields, problems, fixes attempted, fixes that had failed, fixes that had partially worked, but every so often, usually late at night, the way his daughter now wrote late at night, he had allowed himself a longer thought. Rowan pulled the journals down one at a time. She set them on the kitchen table. She turned on the small table lamp. She poured a cup of coffee that would keep her up too late, and she opened the 4th journal, the one from 2013. She found the passage about Hollow Ridge Field on a page dated the 14th of November. Tried the tile drain on the North 40 again this spring. Helped some, not enough. I keep thinking about this field wrong. I keep trying to force it to grow a crop like it's normal ground. And it isn't normal ground. Not yet. This field doesn't need a miracle. It needs organic matter, patience, and something stubborn enough to grow before the soil is ready. I don't have the money to truck and compost by the ton. I don't have the years left in me to wait for it to build up slow the way it should. Maybe Rowan will have both someday, the money or the years. Maybe she will figure something I couldn't. Rowan read it twice. Then she read it a 3rd time. She sat at the kitchen table with the journal open in front of her, and she thought about the 3 piles in the barn, and something in her chest that had been tight since the dock loosened a little. She wasn't planting food into Hollow Ridge Field. She was planting a beginning. She wrote in her own notebook beneath the day's date. Dad knew what this field needed. He didn't have the material. I have 400 sacks of it. Seed to start something living. Feed to reduce cost elsewhere so I can afford to be patient. Compost to change what's actually wrong with the dirt. This isn't a gamble. This is doing what he couldn't afford to do. She closed the journal, but she didn't put it away. She left it on the kitchen table where she could see it, where she would see it every morning for the rest of the season. Then she stood up and she walked out to the barn. There was a tool she had been avoiding since her father died. Not consciously avoiding, just not using. It hung on the wall on the 2nd peg from the left, above the workbench where Elias had spent 30 years fixing what needed fixing. It was a spade. A long-handled spading fork of the kind serious garden farmers used to work heavy ground where a rotary tiller would only make things worse. The head was solid steel, still sharp because Elias had believed a dull tool was a dishonest tool. The handle was ash. The grip end had been worn to a specific shape by 20 years of her father's right hand. Rowan took it down. She held it upright with the handle end in her right palm. Her hand fit exactly where his had fit. She stood there for a long time in the yellow light of the barn with a dead man's spade in her hand and the smell of 400 sorted potatoes thick in the air behind her. She said out loud, quiet, "I have what you didn't have, Dad." Nobody was there to hear it, which was maybe the point. The feed store in Marion County ran on the same fuel every rural feed store runs on. Genuine agricultural necessity and the informal social network that assembled around it. And Rowan Merritt understood, driving in the following Tuesday morning for chicken feed and hog supplement, exactly what she was walking into. She felt the room shift the moment she came through the door, not dramatically, in the specific way a room shifts when the conversation that was happening in it 30 seconds ago was about the person who just walked in. The talk didn't stop, it just changed register. 400 sacks for that dead clay field. She must be worse off than we thought. She kept her face steady. She placed her order with Marvin Boyle behind the counter, who was decent enough not to join in. And while Marvin was pulling her supplement bags together in the back, she heard the two men by the fertilizer shelf keep going without lowering their voices much. Sutter Creek boys already lost half their spring planting to standing water. That bottom land soaked clean through. Prices are going to climb by fall if nobody else picks up the slack. Not going to be Rowan Merritt picking up any slack. Not off that field. Wade Coulter came around the end cap of the second aisle with a bag of chick starter under his arm and looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has been enjoying a story and has just gotten a better ending delivered to him in person. "Heard you bought Curtis Halloway's whole reject pile." "I did." "What are you planning to do with 400 sacks of rot?" "Plant some of it, feed some of it to the animals, compost the rest." Wade looked genuinely delighted by this answer. The way a man looks when a joke he has already decided is funny gets even funnier with more detail. "You're going to plant it in the brick field." "That's right." He said her name like it was doing some of the talking for him. "Rowan, that field beat your daddy for 20 years. Beat him with good seed, good weather, and a drain line he paid a contractor to put in. He knew this ground better than you ever will, and it still won. He let that sit a second before he finished it. You're going to beat it with what Curtis Halloway couldn't sell." Marvin set her supplement on the counter, not quite looking at either of them. Rowan said, "We'll see." She paid. She loaded her truck. She didn't say anything else. She drove out of the feed store lot with her jaw tight in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. And she pulled up at the first stop sign past the property line and just sat there for a moment with the engine idling. It wasn't the mockery about the potatoes that stayed with her. She could absorb that. It was he knew this ground better than you ever will. That was the part that found the soft place. That was the part that pressed. She was about to pull away from the stop sign when a familiar shape moved into her peripheral vision on the passenger side. She looked over. Alden Whittle was walking down the sidewalk toward his truck, 72 years old, tall, bone-thin, a face weathered by 50 years of Ohio winters and 40 years of something he had never talked about out loud. He had been Elias Merritt's oldest friend. He had been a pallbearer at Elias's funeral. He had come by the farm exactly twice in the 3 years since, both times to bring a jar of something his sister had canned. Both times leaving after less than 10 minutes, he saw Rowan in the truck. He stopped walking. He crossed the street. He came up to her open window, and he stood there for a moment without speaking, in the specific way of an old man who is deciding whether or not to say something. Then he said it. "Your father was right about a great many things this county did not want it to admit he was right about." Rowan waited. "Wade Coulter is one of them." That was all he said. He touched the brim of his cap once, not quite a tip, not quite a salute, and he walked onto his truck and he drove away. Rowan sat at the stop sign for another minute after Alden's truck had disappeared down Route 12. There was a history there. Something specific between her father and Wade Coulter that she had never been told. Something that was apparently still recognizable to a 72-year-old man who had known both of them for 40 years. She filed that away. She pulled away from the stop sign and drove home. The next 2 weeks were consumed by turning 286 sacks of sprouted potatoes into planting material. And it was slower, more exacting work than Rowan had expected. Not every sprouted potato was suitable whole. Most needed cutting into seed pieces, sections with at least one strong eye, rough, egg-sized, enough stored energy to feed the new sprout until it established its own roots. Cut too small and the piece wouldn't carry enough reserve. Cut poorly and rot could spread from a bad section into a good one. cut with a dull knife, and every wound became an entry for the specific soft rot bacteria that lived in hollow ridge clay. She set up a cutting station on a folding table in the barn, a board, a knife she sharpened every morning before she started, a bucket for the pieces, a bucket for the waste which went straight into the compost pile, and beside the board open to the November 2013 entry, her father's fourth journal. She read the entry every morning before she started cutting. She did not know why exactly. She only knew that reading it steadied something. She worked through the sacks in sessions, a few hours at a time. Over almost 2 weeks, by the time she finished, she had cut 11,000 and change seed pieces. She wrote in her notebook, 11,000 pieces from 286 sacks. This is not a garden. This is a planting. Wade Coulter drove past the barn on the third day of the cutting. Rowan saw the black F-250 slow at the end of the drive. She saw Wade look toward the open barn door, where every flat surface was covered with potato halves drying under the rafters. He slowed further, he looked, and he called out through his open window loud enough to carry. You planning to feed the whole state? Or just embarrass the rest of us? Rowan didn't look up from the cutting board. Wade drove on. The cut pieces needed to cure before going into the ground. A freshly cut potato was an open wound, vulnerable to rot the moment it hit wet soil. Given a few days in a cool, dry, ventilated space, the cut surface calloused over, sealing the wound, making the piece something the field could accept. She spread the pieces in shallow layers across the barn. Old feed sacks over hay bales, screens on sawhorses, and she dusted the cut sides with wood ash from the farmhouse stove, which dried the wound faster and discouraged soft rot. A trick her father had written about in the second journal, back in 1998, when she had been 8 years old, and had spent that whole summer in his shadow because her mother had been in the hospital, and there had been nowhere else for her to be. She thought about that while she worked. Her mother had died when Rowan was 9. Elias had raised her alone. He had never remarried. He had never really tried to. He had just done the work, and he had raised his daughter alongside the work. And by the time Rowan was 15, there had been nothing on that farm she couldn't do with her own 2 hands. That was the inheritance, the knowing. The knowing was worth more than the land. It took 4 days for most of the pieces to callus properly. During those 4 days, she worked the 71 feed-grade sacks into the hog and chicken operation, cooking batches down over an outdoor fire. Mashing them into the ration at a careful ratio she adjusted as she watched the animals respond. The hogs took to it immediately. The chickens came around within a week. This alone made a real difference to the farm's bottom line, with grain prices climbing the way they had been all spring. The 43 sacks of true rot went into the compost bays, layered with straw, chicken manure, stockpiled dried leaves. Within a week, the first bay was steaming faintly in the cool morning air, the visible sign of decomposition doing its invisible work. Hollow Ridge Field in early spring looked exactly like its reputation suggested. Rowan walked it the way she always walked it before doing anything to it. Slow, deliberate. The way her father had taught her without ever formally teaching her, just by doing it in front of her 1,000 times over her childhood. The clay was heavy and cold underfoot, still holding winter's moisture in the low spots. She pushed the spade, her father's spade, its handle worn to fit her hand now the way it had once fit his, into several test spots and found what she expected. Dense, sticky soil that clung to the blade in wet gray clumps, showing almost no visible organic matter, no dark, crumbly humus. No earthworm activity. Nothing but heavy mineral clay, compacted by years of standing water and years of nothing growing to hold it together differently. She marked 6 acres, the driest draining portion, closest to the slight grade that let water move off it fastest in spring. And she decided that 6 acres would be the test. She built raised ridges roughly 8 inches high, running with the slope. She laid compost strips along a portion of the rows from the older bays. She planted the first section in late April. She wrote that evening, 6 acres marked, raised ridges, compost strips in half the rows as a comparison, 11,000 seed pieces going in over the next 10 days. This is the beginning Dad wrote about. She closed the notebook. She stood at the north end of Hollow Ridge Field with her father's spade in her right hand and the last of the April light going gold along the fence line. She looked out across the 6 acres, small, raw, barely a scratch on the fork. The bulk of the field still stretched away to the north, the same brick clay, the same 20-year problem, the same 40 acres that had beaten her father, according to Wade Coulter, according to everyone who had watched Elias Merritt try, according to the visible evidence of every planting attempt for 20 years. She thought about that. She let herself think about it fully. She was not going to fix Hollow Ridge Field in a season. Maybe not in 5 seasons, maybe not in her lifetime, but she had 400 sacks of what nobody wanted. She had the ash from her father's stove. She had his spade in her hand. She had 11,000 seed pieces cut and cured and ready. And she had, for the first time since she had walked out of Curtis Holloway's back lot, with the sacks weighing down the bed of her father's truck, the specific quiet certainty of a person who was no longer wondering whether she was doing the right thing. She was doing what he couldn't afford to do. Whether it worked or not, she was doing it. She turned back toward the house. The rain would come 8 days later, but she didn't know that yet. The rain came on the 8th day. Rowan Merritt had planted the last of the 11,000 seed pieces on the 7th of May, 6 acres of raised ridges running with the slope. Compost strips laid in half the rows as a comparison. She had worked through it in 10 days of long, light, and cold mornings, dawn to dusk, alone except for the hogs grunting through the fence and the hens tracking her progress from their side of the yard. On the 8th of May, she woke before the alarm and knew she could smell it before she saw it. The specific green cold smell of a Midwestern spring rain coming in from the west. She stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched the horizon go the color of old lead. By 7 in the morning, the first drops were tapping the tin roof of the barn. By 9, it was steady. By noon, it was the kind of soaking, methodical rain that Marion County got most years and that most fields absorbed without complaint. Hollow Ridge Field was not most fields. She checked it twice that first afternoon. The ridges were holding. Water was running down the furrows between them the way she had planned. She wrote in her notebook that evening, day 1 of rain, ridges holding, compost sections darker, absorbing more evenly, watching lower quarter for standing water. She went to bed that night with the sound of rain on the roof and her father's journal open on the kitchen table, under the lamp she had forgotten to turn off. Day 2, the rain got heavier. She stood at the north edge of Hollow Ridge in the early afternoon, in her father's brown Carhartt and her rubber muck boots, and she watched water start to pool between the ridges in the lower third of the planting. Not moving, just sitting, the specific dull sheen of water that has met clay and decided it has arrived at its destination. She dug a small trench with the spade to encourage drainage off the corner. It helped for about 20 minutes. She wrote that night. Day 2, standing water in lower third, cut a trench, buying time, not solving. Day 3, the rain finally slowed, then stopped. The sky stayed the same lead gray. The wind picked up, and by evening the temperature had dropped 10 degrees, which was worse than the rain because a cold snap on top of saturated ground meant the roots of anything trying to establish had no path forward. At first light on day 4, she pulled on her boots and her jacket, and she took her father's spade, and she walked out to Hollow Ridge Field. The sky was clearing. The sun coming up over the eastern fence line lit the field in a hard white way that showed everything. The raised ridges were still there. The furrows between them still held water in the lower sections, though most of it had drained overnight. The upper 2/3 of the planting looked mostly all right, dark, muddy, but intact. She walked down to the lower quarter. She stopped at the 3rd row. She knelt in the mud. She pushed the spade in beside the first seed piece she had planted 8 days earlier and lifted a hunk of clay carefully into her free hand. What came out was not a seed piece anymore. It was gray-brown, slimy cold, the specific liquid rot of a potato that had spent too long submerged. The piece had liquefied in the ground exactly the way the worst of the compost sacks had liquefied in the barn. She stared at it for a long moment, then she moved to the next row and dug another one. Same thing. She moved to the next row. Same thing. She dug 6 test holes across the lower quarter of the field over the next hour, working outward from the wettest section. All 6 holes gave her the same result. Seed pieces that should have been firming up, should have been sending out the first white threads of a root system, had instead gone soft. Some had liquefied entirely. Others were half-formed slime with the ghost of a potato shape. In one hole, she pulled up what was left of a piece she recognized. It had been one of the biggest ones she had cut. A whole half potato with 2 strong eyes, and it had disintegrated into gray sludge that came apart in her fingers when she tried to lift it. She sat back on her heels in the mud. She did the math again. She did not want to do it, but she did it anyway. 6 holes across roughly a third of the planting. Every one of them shows total failure. If the pattern held across the lower third, and there was no reason to think it didn't, because the standing water had been consistent across that whole section, then she had lost close to 3,000 seed pieces. 3,000 pieces out of 11,000. Rowan Merritt was 34 years old, and she had been running the Merritt farm alone for 3 years, and she had seen crops fail before. Not like this. Not on this scale. Not on ground she had spent $400 in 11 days of her back, and every ounce of what her father had left her on trying to prove could be brought back to life. She stood up. Her knees were soaked through. Her hands were coated in the specific gray clay that got under fingernails and stayed there for weeks. She was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. She walked back to the house in the mud with the spade over her shoulder, and she did not stop to take off her boots at the back door. She walked into the kitchen in a trail of gray clay across the linoleum, and she stood at the sink and she stared out the window at Hollow Ridge Field. Word got around Marion County fast. She did not know how exactly. She had told no one. But by the following Tuesday, when she pulled up at the gas station on the corner of Route 12 and Main Street to fill the truck, Wade Coulter was already there. He had pulled up on the other side of the pump island. He didn't even get out. He just rolled the window down as she was working the pump and said, loud enough to carry across the pump island and over to the two men filling their tractor cans by the propane cage. Told you that field eats everything you put in it, just like it ate every dollar your daddy ever put in it. The two men at the propane cage looked over. Rowan didn't answer. She finished filling the truck. She screwed the gas cap back on. She paid inside. She walked back to the truck without looking at Wade Coulter, and she pulled out of the station and drove home the long way, the same long way she had driven 3 weeks ago, with 400 sacks of rotting potatoes in the bed of the truck, and Wade's first joke still sitting in her chest. That evening, she walked out to Hollow Ridge Field near dusk, after the chores were done, and she knelt down in the mud at the worst section of the failed planting. The ground was cold through her jeans. The light was going the specific gray-blue of an Ohio spring dusk when the day has been longer than you thought and everything in you is tired at once. 6 acres of raised ridges, half of them showing the sad, sparse gaps where seed pieces had failed to come up. 2/3 of the planting still viable, maybe. 1/3 gone. She dug her hand into the base of one of the worst ridges and pulled out what was left of a seed piece. It came apart in her fingers, gray-brown, slimy, cold. Nothing left of the potato it had been. Nothing yet of the plant it was supposed to become. She sat back on her heels. What if they were right? She let herself sit with it, because she didn't have the energy left that evening to fight it off. Maybe her father had never solved this field, because the field couldn't be solved. Maybe 20 years of a good farmer's best effort followed by his daughter's $400 of reject potatoes was never going to be enough against 40 acres of clay that had been wrong since before either of them were born. Maybe Wade Coulter, as unkind as he was about it, had been right the whole time. She thought about selling the field. Not the vague thinking of the past 2 years, the specific thinking of a person who has done the work and is looking at the evidence and is being honest about it. Sell the 40 acres, take whatever it brought, put the money into the parts of the farm that already worked and stop bleeding time and hope into ground that maybe never wanted to grow anything at all. The mud was cold. Her knees ached. She almost stood up to walk back to the house with that decision made. And then, in the very last of the light, doing the thing she always did even when she didn't consciously mean to, looking, checking, paying attention, she noticed something 2 rows over. A single seed piece, planted in one of the compost strip rows, on a slightly higher, slightly better draining stretch of ground. There was a sprout, small, pale green, barely 3 inches. Pushed up through the clay in the one spot where the drainage had held and the compost had done something, even a small something, to loosen the ground. Rowan stayed kneeling in the mud and looked at it for a long time. One surviving sprout out of 3,000 species wasn't proof of a system working. But it told her something specific and useful. Where the drainage was better and the compost had been added, something had survived that hadn't survived elsewhere. That wasn't a miracle. That was data. She stood up, stiff cold, jeans ruined, and she walked back to the house in the near dark. That night she sat at the kitchen table with her father's journal open beside her own, and she worked through what had gone wrong and what the one survivor suggested about what to change. The lamp threw its narrow yellow circle across the 2 open notebooks, her father's handwriting on the left, her own on the right. 2 generations of the same problem being worked out by 2 generations of the same stubborn family. She wrote for 2 hours. She wrote it in the calm, methodical language she had learned from her father, because panic and self-pity did not solve problems, and only writing solved problems, and only writing forced you to think clearly enough to know what you had learned. Change the method. Higher ridges, 14 inches instead of 8. Drainage channels cut between the worst rows, angled to carry excess water off entirely. Straw mulch on top to slow evaporation without holding the ridge too wet. Concentrate the compost directly beneath where each seed piece will sit rather than spreading it thin across the row. Start from the driest ground and work toward the wettest. Do not repeat the mistake of assuming that one method works uniformly across a field that is not uniform. 3,000 pieces lost, 8,000 remain. That is still 8,000 chances. She underlined the last sentence. She closed both journals. She went to bed at 1 in the morning, and this time she slept. The second planting looked different because Rowan had changed almost everything about her method based on what the failure had taught her. She built the ridges higher, a foot to 14 inches instead of 8. She cut drainage channels between the rows, angled to carry excess water off entirely. She mulched the tops with straw, bales she had bought on account from the Barrett place 2 roads west, on the promise she would settle up in the fall. She concentrated her remaining compost directly beneath where each seed piece would sit rather than spreading it thin, and she started with the driest ground and worked outward, holding the wettest sections for last. She planted the remaining 8,000 seed pieces over 12 days in May, dawn to dark, alone, except for one Saturday. On the third Saturday in May, a truck came down the drive that Rowan had not been expecting. It was a battered green Chevy with a dented tailgate and mud caked up to the wheel wells, and out of it stepped a boy she recognized immediately. Silas Barrett, 16 years old, tall for his age, thin, the son of Thaddeus Barrett, who lived 2 farms west and who had known Elias Merritt for 30 years. Silas had been born the year Rowan turned 18. Rowan had watched him grow up in the specific slow way you watch neighbor children grow up, mostly through the windshield of a truck, passing them at various ages doing various things by the side of the road. He walked up to where she was working on a drainage channel, and he stood there for a moment with his hands in his back pockets in the specific way of a farm-raised boy who has been sent somewhere by his father and doesn't quite know how to begin. Dad said you might could use a hand today. Rowan straightened up. She wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist. Your father say that or your father send you? Both. She almost smiled. She didn't. You want to work? Yes, ma'am. Then let's work. She put him on the drainage channels. It was hard, thankless work, cutting narrow trenches between the ridges at just the right angle to move water off without cutting so deep that the ridges themselves collapsed. She showed him once, watched him do the second one, corrected 2 small things about his angle, and then let him work. He worked for 4 hours without complaining. He worked in the specific way that farm boys who had been raised by a father who cared worked, steady, unhurried, correcting himself when he saw something off. Rowan watched him out of the corner of her eye for the first hour, and then stopped watching him because he did not need watching. Around noon, she brought out sandwiches, and they ate them sitting on the tailgate of her father's truck in the shade of the barn. Silas didn't say much, neither did Rowan. It was a comfortable, kind of quiet. Then, near the end of sandwich without looking at her, Silas said, Dad worked this field with your father once, when I was little. I don't remember much about it. Just, I remember Dad talking about it one time at supper. About how your father was trying something everybody said wouldn't work, and Dad had come over to help him try it. Rowan looked at him. Did it work? Silas thought about it. I don't think so. Not that time. But Dad said your father wasn't wrong. He just didn't have enough of what he needed. Rowan sat with that for a moment. She said, that sounds about right. Silas finished his sandwich. He looked out across the 6 acres of hollow ridge field, at the raised ridges and the drainage channels and the sacks of straw waiting to be spread. He said in the specific offhand way of a 16-year-old boy, trying not to sound like he was saying something he had been thinking about. Ma'am, I think this is going to work. Rowan didn't answer right away. Then she said, we'll see. They finished the drainage channels by 4 in the afternoon. Silas got back in the green Chevy and he drove home. Rowan watched him go from the barn doorway, and she stood there for a long moment after his taillights had disappeared down the road. There was something in her chest that she did not know what to do with. She wrote in her notebook that evening. Silas Barrett came out today. His father sent him. Tad worked this field with Dad once. It didn't work then either. But he came anyway. That means something. I don't know what yet. But something. 8,000 pieces in the ground. Ridges higher, drainage cut, straw down, compost concentrated at the root zone. This is everything I know how to do differently. Now we wait and watch. 6 weeks after the second planting, the first true rows of green came up. Not scattered survivors this time. Actual rows. Sparse in places where the soil was still working against her, but real, consistent lines of potato plants pushing up through the raised ridges. Rowan walked the field at first light on the 18th of June, and she counted them row by row, section by section, marking her tally in the notebook. She counted for 2 hours. She wrote at the top of the page, first real rows visible, not perfect. Gaps in the lower sections, stronger in the higher ground. But this is a crop now, not an accident, a crop. She stood at the north end of Hollow Ridge Field, with the sun coming up over the eastern fence line, and she looked at the 6 acres of thin green rows stretching away from her. And for a moment she let herself feel the specific quiet thing that she had not let herself feel since the failure of the first planting. Then she went back to the barn and she got to work on the next problem, because there was always a next problem. The next problem showed up in early June in the form of small, striped, voracious insects. Colorado potato beetle. Rowan found the first cluster of eggs on a leaf's underside during her morning walk. Small yellow-orange clusters glued to the leaf like caviar. She had known they would come. Every potato patch in the county got them eventually. But knowing they would come and seeing the first eggs were 2 different things. She did not have the budget for a commercial treatment across 6 acres. BD spray was expensive. Neem was expensive. Even the cheap conventional insecticides that the extension office recommended for beetle control were expensive. And by early June, she was already stretched thin on cash. The second planting had cost her more straw than she had planned. And the feed bill for the previous month was still sitting on the kitchen table, waiting for her to figure out how to pay. She thought about the chickens. It was a legitimate strategy, moving a portable enclosure through infested rows, letting the birds clean up beetles and larvae before moving them along. Her father had written about it once, in the seventh journal, a three-line entry from 2009 that Rowan had read a dozen times in the past week. Chickens will eat beetle. Don't leave them long. They will take the plants down to nothing if you let them. She built the enclosure out of scrap chicken wire and cedar posts. She set it up on the second row of the worst hit section. She herded a dozen hens into it late in the afternoon of the 3rd of June. She got it wrong the first time. Too many birds, too small a section. The beetles got cleaned up. The hens went at them the way hens go at anything with legs and no defenses. But the chickens also scratched and pecked at several young plants, damaging stems, uprooting a few shallow-rooted seedlings. By the time Rowan came back the next morning, 12 plants were dead. 12 plants, not the end of the world. But she stood there looking at them in the early light with the smell of chicken and disturbed clay in her nose, and something in her went very still. She had done this to herself. She had failed her way through the first planting because the weather was against her, and she had not planned for what the weather could do. That was one thing. That was a thing you could correct and move on from. Being wrong about the weather was a farmer's condition. Being wrong about the chickens was different. The chickens had been her plan. She had built the enclosure. She had chosen the birds. She had put them in for that long. And the 12 dead plants were the specific consequence of a decision she had made with all the information she had needed to make it differently. She stood there in the field at 7 in the morning, and she felt for the first time since the 400 sacks that she was not going to make it. Not because she was tired, though she was. Not because she was afraid, though she was. But because she had made a bad decision on ground that not take any more bad decisions. And she had done it herself, and she could not blame anyone else for it. She went back to the house. She got in the truck. She drove to town. The Marion County Cemetery sat on a low hill on the west side of Beecher Hollow, on a road that curved gently up through a grove of old oaks and came out at the top with a view across the whole valley. There was a wrought iron gate at the entrance. There was a small stone chapel that hadn't been used for services in 40 years. And there was the section on the east side where the Merritt plots sat near 3 big maples that had been there since before Rowan's grandfather had been buried in the ground beneath them. Elias Merritt's headstone was still bright. 3 winters had not yet started to dull the granite, his full name across the top. The dates, his birth in 1954, his death in January of 2021, cut deep and clean. And beneath the dates, the words Rowan had chosen because she could not think of anything else to say. He did the work. She stood in front of it for a long time. She did not cry. She had cried enough at his funeral. She had cried enough the first winter when she had realized how much of the farm's operation had been carried in his head and not in any notebook. She had cried enough the second winter, coming out to the barn on a January morning and being cold-slapped by the memory of finding him on the floor there 2 years earlier. She was past crying about her father. She was into something else. She said, out loud quiet, "I don't know how you did it." 20 years on that ground, the maples obeyed the specific soft sound old maples make in an early June breeze. She said, "I don't know how you kept going after every failure. I don't know where you put it. I don't know how you got up the next morning and tried the next thing. I don't know how you did it alone. I have not done it alone as long as you did. I don't know how much longer I can." She stood there for another minute. Then she said, 12 plants. That's what I killed today. Just 12. And I'm out here like it's the whole crop. I know it isn't. I know that. Another pause. I just don't know how you kept going. The maples again. A jay called from the far side of the cemetery. Somewhere down the road, a tractor started up in a hayfield. Rowan stood in front of her father's grave, and she waited not for an answer, because she didn't believe in answers from headstones, but for whatever the moment was going to be. She had come here because she had needed to come here. She did not entirely know what for. And then, standing there in the sun, she thought about her father's handwriting on the page in 2013. This field doesn't need a miracle. It needs organic matter. Patience and something stubborn enough to grow before the soil is ready. She thought about the spade, the specific way the handle fit her hand. She thought about Silas Barrett working the drainage channels for 4 hours without complaining. She thought about the small, pale green sprout in the mud after the first planting had failed, the one survivor that told her the method could work when the method was right. She thought, and this was the thing she needed to think, and she had come to the cemetery because it was the only place she could think it. I am not doing this alone. I only feel alone. She was not alone. She had her father's 20 years of failure documented in 9 journals on the kitchen table. She had his spade in the barn. She had his handwriting. She had his method, refined and corrected across 2 decades of him trying, failing, adjusting, trying again. She had every mistake he had made written down for her to learn from. She had every partial success he had recorded. She had the specific shape of his thinking preserved in ink and time. She was not alone. She had never been alone. She had just been the only one breathing. She stood there for another moment. She touched the top of the headstone with her palm, not for luck, not because she believed anything about touch and stone, but because it was the closest thing she had to touching him, and she wanted to touch him. Then she turned around and she walked back to the truck and she drove home. She rebuilt the enclosure smaller. 6 hens instead of 12, half the area, 2 hours instead of 6. She supplemented with hand-picking, walking the rows in the early morning with a bucket of soapy water, knocking beetles and larvae into it by hand. Slow, unglamorous, costing nothing but time, which was the one resource she still had more of than money. By late June, the pressure was manageable and the field kept growing. The plants were thigh-high by the end of June, dark green, vigorous, sending up the small white and lavender flowers that meant tubers were forming underground. Rowan walked the field every morning and every evening, doing what her father had always done, doing what he had taught her without ever formally teaching her, looking, checking, paying attention. She saw Wade Coulter's black F-250 drive slow past the north property line on the 28th of June. She was standing at the far end of the field with her hand on a plant, feeling the specific firmness of the stem when she looked up and saw the truck. Wade was driving. He was going 40 on a road he usually drove 60 on. He was looking. She could see his head turn. He did not stop. He did not wave. He did not call out. He drove past. She watched the truck disappear down the road. She thought with a clarity that surprised her, Wade Coulters is not enjoying this anymore. She thought he is starting to see what the field looks like. She thought, and that is bothering him more than any of my failures ever did. She was not sure yet what to do with that thought. She filed it away. She went back to walking the row. She wrote in the notebook that evening, plants thigh high, flowers forming, beetle pressure manageable. Wade drove past today and did not laugh. First time since April, something is shifting. Not sure what yet. The last week of June, the county went into its dry stretch, not a drought, not yet. But no rain for 11 days running. The kind of dry stretch that Marion County got about every 3rd or 4th summer, that most fields could ride out without much trouble because they had the organic matter to hold moisture in the root zone. Hollow Ridge Field did not have that organic matter yet, or most of it didn't. The 6 acres Rowan had amended and mulched, those were holding. She could feel it when she pushed the spade into the ridge. The moisture was there, not much, but enough. The rest of the county was a different matter, and she started hearing it sitting at the feed store when she went in for straw the 2nd of July. The 2 men by the fertilizer shelf, the same 2 men who had been there in April, were talking about the Sutter Creek bottomland. The same fields that had been flooded to ruin in the spring rain were now baking in the dry. The little that had come up after the flood was stunted. Nothing set well. The growers along Sutter Creek were talking about writing off half the season. She heard it at the diner when she stopped in for coffee. She heard it at the post office when she picked up her mail. She heard it from Alden Whittle, who she ran into at the gas station one morning and who said without preamble in the specific way he had of skipping preliminaries. The Sutter Creek boys are done. Rowan looked at him. How done? Half a crop, maybe less. Their prices are going to have to go up 30% to break even. And they don't have 30% to give the school district. Rowan waited. Alden looked at her. He looked out across the pumps of the town. You're going to be sitting on the only real potato crop in the county come September. He touched the brim of his cap. He walked on. Rowan stood there for a moment. She had known. She had known since Curtis Halloway had said it to her at the loading dock in April. She had known since the feed store rumor mill had confirmed it a week later. She had known since the county had gone into its dry stretch. But knowing something and having it said aloud by Alden Whittle at the corner gas station were 2 different things. She got in the truck. She drove home. She walked out to Hollow Ridge Field in the late afternoon light, and she stood at the north end of the 6 acres, and she looked at what she had done. Not perfect. Gaps in the lower sections where the second planting had run into the same drainage problems as the first, though not as badly. Stronger in the higher sections where she had amended more heavily. The whole thing sitting under a thin blanket of straw mulch that had held the moisture through the dry stretch. The plants dark green, the flowers giving way now to the specific pale green tubers just beginning to form underground. She did the math one more time. 6 acres, 8,000 pieces gone in. She would lose some to root disease before harvest. She would lose some to voles. She would lose some to the ongoing beetle pressure that the chickens and the hand-picking would only ever manage, not eliminate. But if two-thirds of the second planting made it to harvest, and if each plant produced even a modest yield of usable tubers, she stopped doing the math and she just looked at the field. She thought about her father standing in this same spot 20 years earlier. She thought about him standing here at 50. She thought about him standing here at 60. She thought about him doing the same math she was doing now, over and over, on ground that had never once given him what she was about to receive from it. She said out loud, quiet, "This one's yours, Dad." The maples along the north fence line made the specific soft sound early July maples make in a dry stretch. She walked back to the house in the last of the light. She wrote in her notebook that night, "Sutter Creek is done. Alden says it. Everyone is going to say it by August. The county is going to need what I have. 6 acres, not the whole 40, but 6." She stopped writing. She looked at the page for a long moment. Then she added one more line. "Dad, if you can see this, it worked." She closed the notebook. She turned off the kitchen lamp. And she went out and checked the field one last time before bed, because that was what her father had always done, and because that was what she had learned to do by watching it 1,000 times. And because now, in this specific season, on this specific ground, at this specific time, she was becoming the kind of farmer he had always been. The kind who checked one more time, the kind who did not walk away when the work was hard, the kind who understood that this was not one field or one season or one crop. This was a life. August in Marion County came in the specific dry, tight-shouldered way it came in bad years. The Sutter Creek bottom land was visible from Route 12 if you drove out east past the elementary school and slowed at the second bridge. Rowan Merritt drove it that first Tuesday in August because she had errands in town and because she wanted to see, with her own eyes, what she had only heard about at the feed store and the gas station and the diner counter. She saw it. The bottom land ran flat and pale to the horizon. What had been planted after the March flood had come up thin and stunted and had never made it back. There were fields where the rows were visible, only if you knew where to look for them. Dark scratches of what had once been a crop against the pale dust of a soil that had been asked for too much and had answered with what it had left. She drove past slow. She did not stop. She did not want anyone to see her stopping. She had 6 acres of dark green potato plants, standing thigh-high 2 miles north of Route 12. And she was starting to understand what that meant in a county whose bottom land was done. She stopped at the school on her way back into town. She had not planned to. She parked at the curb across the street from the elementary school, and she sat in the truck for a moment watching the front doors. School was out for summer, but the district office was open. Small brick building attached to the main school building, where the superintendent and the 2 secretaries and the woman who ran the summer lunch program all worked out of the same set of offices. The woman who ran the summer lunch program was a middle-aged woman named Merrill Ashby. Rowan had known her since Merrill had been the cook at the elementary school for a decade before she got promoted. Merrill had put lunches in front of Rowan 1,000 times when Rowan had been in the 2nd grade, in the 3rd grade, in the 5th grade. Merrill had known Elias Merritt. Rowan sat in the truck for a long moment, then she got out. Merrill was at the front counter of the district office sorting invoices when Rowan came through the door. She looked up. She smiled the small, tired smile of a woman working through August paperwork. "Rowan, what can I do for you?" Rowan did not sit down. She stood at the counter with her hands in her jacket pockets. "How's your fall potato budget looking?" Merrill's smile faded. She looked at Rowan. "How much do you know?" "I know Sutter Creek's done. I know your regional supplier is quoting high. I know you've got 300 kids coming back in 3 weeks and every one of them expecting potatoes on the tray at least twice a week." Merrill looked at her for a long moment. "Rowan, do you have potatoes?" "I have 6 acres of potatoes." The silence in the district office was the specific silence of a woman doing arithmetic in her head very fast. Merrill said, quiet, "How much can you sell to us? How much do you need?" Merrill told her. It was a number that would have sounded impossible to Rowan 4 months ago. It sounded, this afternoon in August, like a number she could work with. She said, "Let me get you the first delivery in September. We'll work from there." Merrill reached across the counter and took Rowan's hand in both of hers and did not say anything for a moment. Then Merrill said, "I need to tell you something. This morning, my regional supplier called me and told me he was going up 35% because of Sutter Creek. 35%. I had already told the superintendent we were going to have to pull potatoes off the menu twice a week. 300 kids, coming back to a lunch line with no potatoes on it. Rowan, do you understand what you just did for me?" Rowan did not know what to say. She said, "I'll get you the first delivery in September." She walked out of the district office. She sat in the truck for a moment in the parking lot. Then she drove home. She did not go back inside the house. She walked straight out to Hollow Ridge Field. She stood at the north end of the 6 acres in the last of the August light. and she looked at what she had done. She said out loud, quiet, 300 kids, Dad. The plants did not answer. But she heard him anyway. She dug the first test row on the second Tuesday of September. She used her father's spade. The long-handled spool fork with the ash handle worn to the shape of her hand, and before that to the shape of his. He worked it into the ground beside the first plant in the highest drainage section of the 6 acres, and she rocked it back to loosen the ridge without slicing through anything she couldn't yet see. She lifted the plant. The tubers came up with it, 6 of them, solid, clean-skinned, the specific creamy tan of good storage potato, unmarked by scab or rot with the pale eyes still slightly recessed. She held one in her hand. She turned it over. She rubbed her thumb across the skin. It was firm all the way through. She sat down in the dirt at the head of the row. She did not do the math yet. She just sat there for a moment holding the first potato of the harvest with both hands. Then she said quiet, I did it, Dad. The sun was coming up over the eastern fence line. The maples along the north line were starting to turn at the tips. The plants stretched away from her in dark green rows across 6 acres that had been 40 acres of nothing 4 months earlier. She said it again, louder this time, because there was nobody to hear it and because it needed to be said. I did it. She dug the plant next to the first one and got 7 more tubers. She dug the one next to that and got 8. She worked her way down the first row, and by the end of the row, she had her hands full with the specific weight of a first potato harvest that was going to be, if the rest of the field held, 4 times what her father's record suggested was possible from that ground. She stood up, her knees creaked, her back was tight. She walked back to the barn. She did not tell anyone yet. Not that day. She wanted to do the count first, in her own barn with her own scale, so that when she told people what she had, she would be telling them a number she could stand behind. The harvest took 6 days. She started before dawn and worked until she could not see the fork tines in the dirt anymore. Silas Barrett came out for 2 of the days. He worked in the same steady, unhurried way he had worked the drainage channels in May. And this time, Rowan did not have to watch him at all. He knew what he was doing. She knew that he knew, and they worked past each other in the rows without speaking. At the end of the second day, sitting on the tailgate with sandwiches again, Silas said, You knew, didn't you? Rowan looked at him. Knew what? That it was going to work. Back in May, when I said it was going to work. You knew Rowan thought about that. She said, No, I didn't know. I hoped. There's a difference. Silas thought about that. He said, My dad's hope is what farmers eat when the crop's not in yet. Rowan almost smiled. Your dad's a wise man. He's just repeating something your dad said to him once. Rowan set her sandwich down very carefully. She said, When? Silas thought about it. Long time ago. Before I was born, I think. Dad was over like your father was something, and your father said it. Dad's been repeating it ever since. Rowan looked out across the 6 acres, the rows they had dug, the rows still standing. The dark green plants going yellow now at the tops. The way potato plants went yellow when the tubers underground were mature and ready. She said, quiet, That's the second thing I've learned this year that my father said, and I never heard. Silas didn't answer. He didn't need to. They finished the sandwiches. They went back to work. The final count came out to something Rowan had not quite let herself believe was possible even after digging the first row. 6 acres yields 4 times what her father's records suggested from that ground. Enough potatoes stacked in the barn, and by the 3rd week of September, that she had to open the second bay of the storage room, which had not been used since her father's last good year in 2017. She stood in the barn with the door open and the September sun coming through in yellow slats, and she looked at the crates. Row after row, stacked chest high, the specific accumulated weight of a crop that had not existed 4 months ago. She sat down on an overturned crate. She wrote in the notebook, harvest complete, yield calculation done. 4 times Dad's projected, not because the whole field is fixed, because the section drained and mulched properly, responded exactly the way the theory said they would. This is a beginning, not an ending. But it is a beginning that will feed this county through the winter. She closed the notebook. She walked into town. She started with Curtis Halloway. She backed the truck up to the same loading dock at Route 12 Farm Market, where 5 months earlier he had helped her load 400 sacks of rotting produce that his own operation had been about to throw away. She got out. She dropped the tailgate. Curtis came out of the loading bay, wiping his hands on his apron. He walked over to the truck. He looked at the crates. He reached in. He picked up a potato. He turned it over in his hand. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, quiet, These came off Hollow Ridge. 6 acres of it. This is good stock, Rowan. I know it is. He looked at her. How much are you selling? She named a price. It was fair. It was under what the regional supplier was quoting. It was over what she could have gotten wholesale in a normal year. It was the specific number she had worked out at the kitchen table the night before, using her father's method to figure the cost, figure the labor, figure the risk, figure the season. and price it where it needed to be priced to move. Curtis nodded. I'll take all you can bring me. They unloaded together. When the last crate was on the dock, Curtis said quiet, without looking at her, Wade Coulter was in here last week. Buying feed, Rowan waited. He asked me what I'd heard about your harvest. I told him I hadn't heard anything yet. Had you? Nothing you'd need me to repeat. Rowan understood. She said, thank you, Curtis. Nothing to thank me for. She drove from the market to the district office. Merrill Ashby met her at the loading dock at the back of the elementary school. Rowan unloaded the first deliveries herself. Merrill stood watching her with her arms folded and something working in her face that Rowan did not want to see close up. When Rowan closed the tailgate, Merrill said, Rowan, I need you to know something. My husband died in June. Cancer. It was fat. I didn't tell anyone at work because I didn't want. I came back to this job in July because I needed to. And I have been holding this fall lunch program together with tape and prayer for 8 weeks because if I couldn't feed those kids, I did not know what I was going to do with myself. Rowan stood at the tailgate. Merrill said, you did not know any of that, and you brought me potatoes anyway. And I am telling you now because you should know that what you did today matters more than you know. Rowan did not know what to say. She said, I'm sorry about your husband, Merrill. I know you are. Your father was the same way. You didn't have to say more than you said. He always said exactly enough and stopped. Rowan swallowed. She said, I miss him. Merrill said, he fixed my wood stove twice in 10 years and would not take money for it either time. Rowan drove home in the late afternoon light. She did not cry. She had not cried since her father died, and she was not going to start that this afternoon. But she pulled over once at the top of the ridge road looking down across the valley, and she sat in the truck with the engine off for a long moment. Then she drove home. The farm stand at the end of the drive had a hand-lettered sign taped to the front of the plywood counter by the fourth Saturday of September. Hollow Ridge Potatoes. Rowan had made the sign the night before. She had used the same brown paint her father had used for the barn touch-ups, and she had lettered it with the specific slight lean to the right that his own hand had always had. She did not mean to imitate his lettering. It just came out that way. By the third day, there was a line. She had never seen a line at the farm stand. Not in 3 years of running it alone, not in the 15 years before that when she had helped her father run it. The Merritt farm stand had always been a slow, steady thing, a customer or two on a Saturday morning. Some regulars who stopped for eggs on Wednesdays, the specific quiet foot traffic of a small operation on a back road. The fourth Saturday of September, there were 7 trucks in the drive by 10 in the morning. By noon, there were 12. By 2 in the afternoon, there were 15. Rowan worked the counter. She weighed potatoes on her father's old hanging scale, the one he had used at the stand since before she was born, the one whose numbers had faded to near illegibility, and whose springs she had recalibrated by hand the previous winter. She took cash and gave change out of the same green tin box he had used. She answered the same three questions over and over. Yes, they came off Hollow Ridge. Yes, 6 acres of them. Yes, I know what everyone said about that field. She had not expected the last part. She had not expected people to come to the stand not just to buy potatoes, but to see them, to hold one, to turn it over, to confirm with their own hands the thing they had heard about at the diner and the feed store and the post office. Rowan Merritt got a crop off the brick field. She sold to the diner on Main Street. She sold to the church pantry on Elm Street, a straight donation of 6 crates, dropped off at the back door on a Tuesday morning because the pantry volunteer had been keeping a cardboard sign on the front table for 3 weeks that said, "Potato sort please help," and Rowan could not walk past a sign like that. She sold to the district office in 3 separate deliveries that fed the elementary school and the middle school and the high school through the whole fall. By the first week of October, she had sold most of the crop. By the second Saturday of October, the line at the farm stand had not slowed down. She had a handwritten waiting list on a clipboard next to the scale of people who wanted seed potatoes for their own small plots the following spring. The list had 38 names on it. She stood at the counter that Saturday afternoon with the sun coming down slantwise across the drive, and she watched a small white van with the elementary school district logo on the side pull in and park. Merrill Ashby got out. She walked up to the stand. She was smiling in the specific, small, careful way that Rowan had learned to recognize on Merrill's face over the course of 5 deliveries. Merrill said, "I need 2 crates for Monday." Rowan pulled 2 from the back. Merrill loaded them into the van herself. When she closed the back door, she turned around and looked at Rowan and said, "These are going into 300 lunch trays tomorrow." Rowan felt something go still in her chest. Merrill said, "I just wanted you to know." She got in the van. She waved. She drove away. Rowan stood in the drive for a long moment after the van had pulled out. There was a warmth coming up through her chest that she did not know how to name. Not pride, exactly. Not vindication, exactly. Something quieter than either of those. something that had to do with 300 kids sitting down at cafeteria tables on Monday morning and finding on their trays potatoes that had been dug out of the ground her father had spent 20 years trying to wake up. She went back to the stand. She had two more customers to help before the day ended. The next truck down the drive was Wade Coulter's. She saw the black F-250 come around the bend at the end of the county road, and she felt the specific tightening in her chest that she had not entirely worked past since the gas station, since Wade's voice through the pump island, since just like it ate every dollar your daddy ever put in it. He parked at the far end of the drive. He got out slow. He walked up to the stand. He was in his 40s still. Tall, broad-shouldered in the way of a man who had worked on his own equipment his whole adult life. He walked with his hands in the front pockets of his jeans, and he did not meet Rowan's eyes at first. He stopped at the counter. He looked at the crate on the display. He picked up a potato. He turned it over. He said, "Quiet, these really came off Hollow Ridge. They did 6 acres of it, 6 acres. This year. More next year." He set the potato back down. He looked at her. "I heard you lost thousands of pieces in the first rain. 3,000 out of 11, and you just replanted, changed the method, then replanted?" "Yes." He nodded slow, in the specific way of a man who's been thinking about something for a long time and is now saying it out loud for the first time. "I laughed at you back in April at the market, and again at the gas station. I said things about your father I shouldn't have said." Rowan waited. She did not help him. He said, "I saw 400 sacks of rot going into a truck headed for a field that beat every good farmer who tried it, including your father. I saw rot and I saw a bad field, and I put those two things together and figured I knew how the story ended." Rowan said, "You saw sprouts and rot. I saw a field that needed a beginning." Wade stood with that for a moment. He said, "That's a better way of putting it than I would have come up with." He looked at the potato in the crate. He looked at the sign, Hollow Ridge Potatoes, in her father's brown paint on plywood. Then he did the thing she had not expected. He said, "There's something I need to tell you about your father." Rowan went still. Wade said, "In 2009, your father and I had a disagreement about the east property line, the line that runs along the fence between your north pasture and my south field. Your father said his survey showed the fence was 6 feet inside my property. My survey, the one my father had done in the 60s, showed the fence was on the line. It was a small piece of ground, 6 feet by about 400 feet, 1,600 square feet, not much. But it mattered to me because my father had drawn that line, and I did not want to be the son who lost even 6 feet of what my father had drawn." Rowan waited. Wade said, "Your father hired a new surveyor, a licensed one out of Columbus. The survey came back and it said what your father had said all along. The fence was 6 feet inside my property. Your father offered to move the fence back at his own cost. I refused. I said the old fence had been there since before either of us was born, and moving it now was insulting. Your father said the fence was in the wrong place, and he wanted the record corrected. We argued about it for a month. I finally told him he could move the fence or not move the fence, and I did not care which, but I was done talking about it. Your father moved the fence, at his own cost. He did it in a weekend. He never mentioned it to me again." Rowan listened. Wade said that, "I never thanked him. I never apologized for how I handled it. I never admitted in the 15 years since that he had been right and I had been wrong. I could not admit it. My father had drawn that line. Admitting your father was right meant admitting my father had been wrong, and I was not going to do that." He looked at her. He looked away. He said, When your father died, I did not go to the funeral. I told myself I was too busy. I was not too busy. Did not go because I could not stand in that church and stand at that graveside and admit to myself what I had done to a good man over 1,600 square feet of ground my father had drawn wrong. And when you came home to run the farm alone and I saw you struggling, I told myself I was not going to help. And when I saw you buy those 400 sacks in April, I laughed. Because it was easier to laugh at you than it was to think about your father. Because as long as I could laugh at you, I did not have to think about the thing I owed him that I had never paid." He stopped. Rowan did not speak. Wade said, "Your father was right in 2009. You are right now. I have been wrong twice about the same family, and I do not know how to make that up. But I wanted to say it. I wanted you to know that I know it." He picked up 2 full bags of potatoes off the display, more than he needed for one household. He set 2 $20 bills on the counter, which was more than they cost. He said, not looking at her, "If you need help on that field next spring, the drainage work, whatever you are planning for the rest of the acreage. I've got a tractor and I've got some time in April most years." Rowan looked at him for a long moment. She said, "I might take you up on that." He nodded. He walked back to his truck. He got in. He backed down the drive. She watched the black F-250 turn onto the county road and disappear. She stood at the counter for a moment. The next customer was already coming up. She wrote later that night in the notebook, "Wade came today. He said what he needed to say. I did not make it easy. I did not need to make it hard either, he said it. That is enough for now. The last visitor of the afternoon was Alden Whittle. He came down the drive slow in his old Ford. He got out slow. He walked up to the stand slow. He was 72 years old, and his back was not what it had been, and Rowan came out from behind the counter and pulled a chair out for him to sit down on before he had reached the stand. He sat down. He accepted a cup of coffee from the thermos she kept behind the counter for late afternoon customers who wanted to stand around a minute. He looked at the crate of potatoes on the display. He picked one up, he turned it over, he set it back down. He said, quiet, "Your father would understand this." Rowan did not answer. Alden said he would not have been surprised. He would have said it took you long enough. And then he would have gone out to look at the field. Rowan almost laughed. She didn't. Alden said, "I saw Wade Coulter leave here about an hour ago." "You did? Did he say what needed saying?" "Yes." "Good. He should have said it 15 years ago. He should have said it 3 winters ago at your father's funeral, but he said it today. That is not nothing." Rowan waited. Alden said, "Your father knew what Wade did in '09. Your father did not talk about it. Your father moved the fence and went on with his life. But he knew. And he told me once, he said, some men will find a way to be right their whole lives. And some men will find a way to be honest eventually. And the difference between them is not the timing. It is whether they get there at all." Rowan looked at him. Alden said, "Wade got there today. It took him longer than most, but he got there." He set his coffee cup down on the counter. He stood up slow. He picked up a bag of potatoes. He paid her the correct amount and refused to take any back. He said, "At the top of the drive, your father would understand this. Just so you know." He touched the brim of his cap. He got in the truck. He drove away. Rowan stood at the counter for a long moment in the last of the afternoon light. She did not write anything in the notebook that night about Alden. Some things did not need to be written down. Some things you carried in your chest, and that was enough. By the time the harvest was fully in and sold, Rowan Merritt had a clear-eyed picture of what she had actually accomplished. Because she had been keeping records the entire time, and records did not let you round up. 6 acres out of 40 had been treated, drained, mulched, amended, planted, and replanted with careful attention. Those 6 acres had produced a real, meaningful harvest, 4 times what the untreated ground would have given her. Proof that her father's old journal entry from 2013 had been right all along, but 34 acres remained exactly what they had always been. Heavy clay, poor drainage, no organic matter to speak of, waiting for their own turn at the same slow work. She wrote it out plain in the notebook, sitting at the kitchen table on the first cold night of October with her father's 4th journal open beside her. Hollow Ridge is not fixed. 6 acres are different than they were in April. 34 are not yet. This was never going to be a one-season miracle. And I am glad I did not let myself believe it would be. Because the 6 acres that worked. Because I paid attention to every failure and adjusted instead of quitting or pretending the failures were not real. Next spring, expand the treated acreage, more compost, a full season of potato waste compost finished now, more drainage work. Wade Coulter offered his tractor, which I did not expect and am not too proud to use. Dad wrote that this field needed patience. He did not say how much. I do not think there is a number. I think you just keep giving it what it needs until it stops needing it. But I know this. 400 sacks nobody wanted carried this farm through a summer of rising grain prices, changed 6 acres of dead clay into ground that could grow something, and put food on tables at the school, the pantry, the diner, and half of Marion County's kitchens this fall. Nobody is laughing at hollow ridges anymore. That is not the same as the field being fixed, but it is the same as the work being real. She closed the notebook. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time in the yellow lamplight. Then she went out to the barn one last time. Not because there was anything left to do, but because the barn was where her father had died 3 winters earlier on a January morning, and because she wanted to stand in it for a minute with the specific accumulated weight of the year behind her. She stood in the barn doorway in her father's brown Carhartt. She looked at the storage room, full, 2 bays. The winter's crop. She looked at the workbench. Her father's tools now. She looked at the peg where her father's spade had hung for 20 years and where it hung again now, cleaned and sharpened and ready for spring. She said quiet into the empty barn, 6 acres, Dad, this year. The barn did not answer, but she knew what he would have said. He would have said good, and then he would have said, now do more. The following April, Rowan Merritt stood at the edge of Hollow Ridge Field with Wade Coulter's tractor idling behind her. She was marking out 12 new acres to bring into the treated rotation, double what she had managed the year before, made possible by a full season of finished compost, and by the lessons written into every page of the notebook built since the day she had watched a loader push 400 sacks of rejected potatoes toward Ubsterber and had said, without quite knowing why, I'll take all of them. Curtis Halloway had called her twice that winter, Once about a load of soft onions the market could not move. Once about a pallet of bruised apples. Both times Rowan had said yes. Both times the material had gone exactly where it needed to go. Seed where seed made sense. Feed where feed made sense. Compost where nothing else would do. The school district had put in an early order for the fall. Merrill Ashby had called Rowan personally to place it and had stayed on the line for 20 minutes talking about nothing much in particular. And Rowan had understood that the call was not really about potatoes. The diner owner had asked if she could supply through the whole winter this time. She had said she could. The church pantry volunteer had started saving Rowan a seat at the Wednesday coffee gathering, which in Marion County terms was its own kind of recognition, the specific quiet inclusion of a woman who had, at some point over the previous year, become someone the community held onto rather than watched from a distance. Silas Barrett had asked to work summers. Rowan had said yes to that too. She had her father's spade in her right hand as she stood at the edge of the field. The ash handle worn to fit her hand now, permanently, the way it had once fit his. She looked out at the 6 acres that had come through their first full year of treatment. The soil there visibly darker now than the surrounding clay, holding together differently when she pressed her boot into it. The specific quality of ground that has begun to remember how to be ground. Then she looked at the 34 acres still waiting. Wade Coulter climbed down from his tractor and walked over. He stood at the fence line next to her without saying anything. He looked out at the field. He said after a while, "Your father would have liked this." Rowan looked at him. She looked out at the 12 acres marked in orange flags. She looked back at Wade. She said, "My father would have walked the rows twice before he said anything." Wade almost smiled. "That sounds like him." "It does." He walked back to the tractor. Rowan stood at the fence line with her father's spade in her hand for one more moment. Most people standing behind Route 12 Farm Market that April afternoon a year earlier had seen 400 sacks of spoiled potatoes headed for a dumpster. Rowan Merritt had seen seed, she had seen feed, she had seen compost, she had seen a field her father had spent 20 years trying to wake up. Still waiting, still stubborn, still hers to keep working. She did not fix Hollow Ridge Field in one season, nobody could have. But she had started it, one sorted sack, one cut seed piece, one hard rain that taught her what to do differently. One small green sprout in the mud that told her to keep going, one test row dug with her father's spade on the second Tuesday of September. One line at the farm stand that had not slowed down for 6 weeks. One conversation with Wade Coulter that had been 15 years in the making. One Wednesday coffee at the church pantry. One phone call from Merrill Ashby placing the fall order early. One inheritance received. Not the land, not the tools, not the buildings, the knowing. The specific hard-won knowing of a man who had failed on that ground for 20 years and had written every failure down. So that his daughter, 3 winters after his death, on a cold April morning at Route 12 Farm Market, could pick up where he had left off and could finish, feed on a field of 40 acres, the work he had not been able to finish in his lifetime. She started the tractor. Behind her 12 acres waited. Ahead of her 22 more waited beyond those. She had time. She had the method. She had the knowing. And most of all, she had 400 sacks of what nobody wanted and everything they had taught her about what it took to make a beginning. The tractor moved forward across the ground. Rowan Merritt went to work.